In the dusk-shrouded city of Inkenfall, parchment dust always floated in the air like lazy snow, settling on windowsills and the hems of travellers' coats. Scribes, poets, and binders had worked here for centuries, engraving their hopes into vellum and linen paper. Lamps of whale oil glowed in every alley, and the river Inkstone reflected their trembling light in ribbons of molten gold. Yet all the beauty of Inkenfall had begun to wither under the presence of Lord Vrax, the High Redactor. He arrived with an army of officials in lacquer-black armour, carrying shears and branding irons instead of swords. Decrees stapled to doors outlawed dissenting lyrics, outlawed forbidden histories, outlawed jokes that curled too sharply at the ends. The citizens woke each morning to new silence, as entire bookstores disappeared overnight, and the river itself seemed to flow more slowly, thick with swallowed words. Ansel Merryweather, master calligrapher of the ancient scriptorium, had watched the censorship spread like mould on an illuminated scroll. His beard was streaked with iron grey, his fingers stained permanently with silver ink, the rarest in all of Inkenfall, distilled from ore mined beneath the ruined spires. Silver ink shimmered in even the faintest light, and once dry, it was rumoured to keep a word alive for 1,000 years. Ansel kept a flask of the precious substance close to his heart, bound into the lining of his waistcoat, for he suspected its hour would come. On the night Lord Vrax ordered the scriptorium shuttered, Ansel stood alone in the great hall, among toppled lecterns and smashed wax seals, feeling the hush descend like snowfall on a grave. He knelt, unstoppered the silver flask, and dipped his quill. Across town, a teenage courier named Tala Sky rummaged through the remnants of her parents' tiny printing shop. They had been arrested that afternoon, accused of irreverent punctuation. Their presses lay silent, wheels removed, mats confiscated. Tala, quick-fingered and quicker-witted, found a single page left untouched, an unfinished broadside whose first line read, "When silence is commanded, speech becomes the final revolt." She folded it, tucked it inside her sleeve, and hurried toward the abandoned scriptorium. Everyone knew that if hope had any dwelling left, it lived behind those cracked marble columns where Ansel Merryweather still breathed. She reached the gates just as the moon rose, casting its mute testimony over the city stricken dumb. Inside, Ansel worked with feverish calm, tracing letters on fresh parchment he had salvaged moments before redactors smashed the cabinet. Every stroke gleamed argent. He no longer penned essays or poems. He inscribed single words: freedom, memory, laughter, truth, each large enough to span the width of his shoulders. As he finished one, he set it upright against a toppled lectern and began the next. Tala watched, hidden in shadows, until curiosity tugged her forward. "Master Merryweather," she whispered, "they will return by dawn. Words on paper cannot stop their blades." Ansel looked up, emerald eyes blazing. "These words will not stay on paper," he replied, and tapped the flask of silver ink. "Tonight, they are only dreaming, but when they wake, they will walk." The theory was older than the city itself, that certain inks mixed with ore fallen from stars could imbue symbols with a flicker of sentience. Most scholars dismissed it as metaphor, yet Ansel had seen it once when he was a boy, and a love sonnet penned in star-metal ink rose from a diary to dance mid-air before burning out like a firefly. Guided by that memory, he continued writing until the bell of St. Quittin's tolled midnight. Then he set the quill down, looked at Tala, and said, "Speak a wish over them." She hesitated, then whispered the unfinished line she had salvaged. "When silence is commanded, speech becomes the final revolt." The parchment trembled. The word freedom shimmered, its serifs flexing like wings. Then, with a sound like cloth ripping under water, the letters peeled away from the page. They hung in the air, strung together by lines of quicksilver light, expanding until they loomed taller than a man. The O pulsed like a heart. Tala stepped back, hand over mouth, as other parchments joined the exodus. Memory spiraled into a helix of glinting characters. Laughter pirouetted, each curve giggling with chime-like echoes. Truth unfolded into a blade-straight line, sharp enough to slice the dust motes drifting nearby. The pages they had abandoned fluttered to the floor, blank and innocent. The words, alive now, awaited command. Outside the scriptorium, the crack of boots signaled a patrol. Lord Vrax's redactors marched with torches spitting blue flame, ready to confiscate anything inked. Tala looked toward the doors, terror blooming. But Ansel's face had softened, almost serene, as though he listened to distant music. He addressed the silver words, "Defend yourselves. Defend us all." In answer, the characters brightened. Freedom flowed to the front, splitting into twin strands that coiled like serpents and slipped through the cracks beneath the doors. Laughter flitted upward, invisible against the high arches. Truth formed into a slender spear of light. Memory hovered near the ceiling, weaving webs of glimmer in all directions. The redactors forced the doors open, and chaos greeted them. The serpents of freedom struck first, wrapping around the shears in the soldiers' hands and transmuting metal into harmless ash. Helmets clattered to the marble as laughter rained down, pelting the intruders with mirth that infected them unwillingly. Their grim mouths twisted, eyes watering from giggles they couldn't stifle. Truth speared through the torch flames, extinguishing them, leaving only the silver glow to light the room. Memory wove through the ranks, pressing ancient images into their minds. The words their mothers once whispered, the stories their fathers read by hearthlight, the lullabies now forbidden. The redactors dropped to their knees, shaken not by pain but by remembrance, and fled into the night. Word of the miracle spread faster than any broadsheet ever had. By dawn, apprentices from shattered shops, poets whose notebooks had been burned, and even a few repentant redactors gathered before the scriptorium steps. They carried scraps of paper, scrapings of ink, charcoal, chalk, anything that could leave a mark. Ansel stood atop a cracked column base and addressed them. "Silver ink is rare, but intent is rarer still. We need both. Bring hidden reserves, rescue pigments from confiscated shops, melt jewelry if you must. Tonight, we write an army." The crowd roared assent. Tala, at his side, raised the unfinished broadside high like a flag. In secret cellars and attic garrets they mixed vats of ink. Soot blended with starlight dust. Claret wine thickened with powdered pearl. Beetle shell ground fine as breath. Children practiced calligraphy, guided by trembling grandmothers who once taught alphabet in outlawed schools. Each letter had to be formed with care. An ill-shaped glyph could wake twisted and cruel. Meanwhile, Lord Vrax fortified his iron cansorium at the city's centre, ringed by barricades of burned books and armed with catapults loaded with null ink, a tar that erased any word it touched. He summoned the Order of Silence, pale clerics whose tongues were ritually severed, to chant vibrations that cracked ink shells. The stage was set. On the eve of the solstice, clouds reflected a strange flicker from within Inkenfold's maze of roofs. It was not fire, but words, thousands upon thousands, marching, flying, slithering. The people called them the Silver Quill Rebellion. There were banners woven from quotations, wings sculpted out of consonants, shields embossed with palindromes that read the same whether facing enemy or friend. The mightiest creation was a colossus formed by the collective penmanship of 15 scribes, a towering figure whose body spelled the epic of humanity's first story. It walked on phrases like "once upon a dawn," and its fists clenched with the verbs rise and defy. At its heart pulsed Ansel's original word, freedom, now vast as a cathedral bell. They advanced toward the iron sensorium in silence, broken only by the rustle of liberated pages. Lord Vrax stood atop his battlements, cloak of redacted parchment snapping in the wind, and sneered at the spectacle. He raised a gauntlet, signaling the catapults. Tumults of null ink arced into the sky. blacker than raven wings, aimed to splatter across the living texts. The first volley struck a flock of lyric birds, crafted from ballads. Wherever the tar touched, verses dissolved, feathers of stanza falling empty. Mourning cries echoed from the crowd below. The Colossus responded, hurling shards of narrative world-building like meteors, each impact birthing micro-stories that burst into vines of dialogue and tangled around siege towers. Tala, nimble as ever, raced along alley cornices with a satchel of silver ink grenades, glass bulbs whose filaments spelled explosive adjectives. She smashed one against a barricade of burned books. The word resurrect leapt out, restoring the texts to wholeness, and the wind immediately riffled their grateful pages. Citizens scooped them up, reading aloud passages that became shields of recited truth around their bodies. Where a paragraph was spoken with conviction, no arrow could penetrate. The air filled with overlapping literature, a chorus of meaning volleyed against the void. Yet Lord Vrax possessed a final weapon, the red pen absolute, forged from the same meteor ore as Ansel's ink, but twisted by alchemists into an instrument that could sever a story at its root. He descended to the courtyard, trailed by the tongueless clerics, whose silent chants made the ground vibrate. With one stroke, he impaled the word hope, pinning it to a cracked flagstone. The letters spasmed, dimmed, and stilled. A hush rippled through the rebel host. Without hope, other words faltered, paragraphs stuttered, commas bled. Vrax smiled thinly and advanced toward the Colossus. Ansel felt the wound like a dagger in his lungs. He pushed through ranks of living type, ink stains glowing on his hands, and faced Vrax alone. "Your power ends," the High Redactor said, "when the page tears." He raised the red pen absolute for a killing slash. At that instant, Tala leapt from a balcony, landing between the men. She unfurled the unfinished broadside, the line she'd kept folded since the night everything began. Its fibers had absorbed silver ink from her grenades, and now the sentence shone complete. When silence is commanded, speech becomes the final revolt, and revolt writes its own eternity. The parchment blazed, and the sentence ascended, circling above them like a comet tail. The incomplete had become whole, and wholeness breathes resonance. Every word ever censored in Inkenfall felt the pulse. From sewer grates and hearth ashes, from shredded confessions and diaries buried in floorboards, the fragmented syllables of the city stirred. They drifted toward the Cancerium in a soft, steady exhalation, reuniting like water finding the sea. Vrax looked up, suddenly unsure, as the sky darkened with language. Cuneiform fragments hugged Sanskrit half-verses. Outlawed lullabies knitted themselves to suppressed manifestos. The collective expression coalesced into a storm, the lexicon tempest. Lightning of grammar struck the walls, turning iron to irony, stone to stanza. Vrax slashed wildly with the red pen absolute, but for every clause he severed, two more braided around the weapon, converting its blade into an exclamation of defiance. The tongueless clerics dropped to their knees, mouths open in voiceless awe, as ghost tongues of ink unfurled, giving back utterance they had sacrificed. Hansel approached Vrax one final time, holding the resurrected word hope, now small but burning like a coal. "Even erased words leave an indentation," he said, and set the coal against Vrax's parchment cloak. The cloak ignited, unfurling previously redacted names of the tyrant's own ancestors who once wrote poems about freedom. They shone, condemning him with his lineage. Vrax screamed, not in pain, but in the horror of being read. The red pen cracked, down its length bleeding punctuation. He staggered back, and the Colossus of story stepped forward, palm wide as a plaza. It did not crush him. Instead, it offered its surface, a mirror where Vrax saw every text he had destroyed, every life silenced. Faced with the magnitude of what he had tried to erase, The High Redactor collapsed, his armor unraveling into brittle footnotes scattered on the courtyard. The Order of Silence removed their veils, voices newly grown in their throats, and sang a hymn composed of the very pages he'd intended as fuel for fear. With the tyrant fallen, the lexicon tempest calmed. Words settled into streets and squares, becoming murals, fountains and flowering gardens of poetry. Sentient phrases chose resting places. Laughter took roost atop orphanages. Truth embedded itself into court pillars. Memory flowed into the river, ensuring its current would never stagnate again. Ansel and Tala stood amid the transformation. "Will they stay alive forever?" she asked. Ansel smiled. "They will live as long as we read them, write them, speak them. Language is a covenant, not a possession." In the months that followed, Inkenfall rebuilt itself as a sanctuary of expression. Children learned letters by visiting the living alphabet, grazing on the commons, feeding vowels to newborn consonants until they fused into syllables and flew away like kites. Libraries kept doors always open, lanterns glowing green to signal welcome. The position of High Redactor was abolished, replaced by the circle of margin walkers' guardians who ensured no voice strayed unheeded, whether whispered or roared. The Red Pen Absolute was broken into countless quills, each given to a refugee poet from lands still under censorship, a reminder that tools are shaped by the hands that wield them. One quiet evening, Tala found Ansel on a balcony overlooking the river, which now shimmered with drifting couplets. "You never told me why you kept the silver ink hidden so long," she said. He turned the flask between his fingers, watching dust glow inside. "Because I feared that if words could walk, they might also leave us," he confessed. Tala shook her head gently. "They don't leave, they journey, and then they return with new stories to tell." As if in agreement, the word journey surfaced from the water, spiraling in the air before settling at their feet like a loyal dog. Far beyond Inkenfall, rumors flew on merchant caravans of a city where sentences served as sentinels and verses vine-climbed the walls. Despots in distant kingdoms ordered extra patrols at their borders, terrified that rebellious rhetoric might cross unnoticed. And sometimes, under the cover of night, a single silver letter would slip through a prison window or flutter into a censored classroom, offering a promise no edict could kill. It would lay itself on a scrap of whatever could take ink and whisper, "Write." The recipients, unsure whether they dreamed, would obey, and the Silver Quill Rebellion would be born anew, line after line, world without end.